Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Walker, Manager of Athlete Development here at USA Volleyball, and today I'm privileged to be joined by Jonah Carson. Jonah has great experience in both the high school and collegiate space and has been a part of our national team development program for quite a long time. Jonah is currently the head boys varsity coach at St. Francis High School, and he's the club director at Mountain View Volleyball Club. He has also worked with UC Santa Cruz. So in addition, he has been, as I mentioned, a big part of our national team development and high performance program over time. So today, Jonah joins us to be able to share some wisdom on what it means to move to the next level as an athlete and what he would recommend from his coaching career. So thanks for joining us, Jonah.
Thanks for having me.
So to get us started, as we think about it, you've coached in the high school space, you've coached for our national team development program, you've coached in the collegiate space. What are some critical pieces that an athlete needs to think about as they consider moving to the next level of competition?
I think the first challenge for all young athletes kind of getting into this is understanding that evaluation is part of the process. We as coaches are evaluated at every camp, right? Players are evaluated at every camp. And so when you enter this space, there's obviously this goal of making a team and developing. But if you're really thinking about where you are, being a little vulnerable, being willing to evaluate yourself is a pretty important skill. And it's a skill that takes a lot of maturity, takes a lot of support from family, coaches, right? Your own mindset. And I think starting out with having an understanding about like where you are as an athlete is pretty important. Some athletes come in our gym and they've effectively won the genetic lottery, right? They jump high, they hit hard, they're super athletic. Other players don't always have that. And then they've got to figure out what's their pathway, what's their skill set. And you just talk about it from a physical component, but then there's also a skill component. Maybe you're a highly skilled player. Maybe you're incredibly physically talented, but you're not skilled technically. And then you move on to the next component, which is just kind of evaluating your understanding of playing the game. Even some basic things. I mean, we've got young players at this camp this weekend who are just learning some of the basics of rotations and the intricacies of how row 4 is different than row 2. And so all these different components kind of come into play. And I think for a player to evaluate where they are in those different areas, to be a little vulnerable, and by that I mean recognizing where they have some deficiencies and grow, is something that all players who want to be great will do just by self-assessing. Excuse me.
I absolutely love the framing of that invulnerability because it is hard to have that critical look at yourself but not get down on yourself as a young athlete. So as you think about orienting athletes toward a growth mindset, toward maybe some of that process orientation, how do you help them navigate that space of being vulnerable and evaluating where they're at, but also making sure that they recognize it's learning and growth and you're going to fail along the way?
Yeah, I think so much of that comes to the environment that you're in. For young athletes, finding coaches and mentors, even teammates who match your values. There's a thing, and as we're here at the OTC and you think about training environment, right? Even USA Wrestling and those athletes, they're not all in the same weight class, for example, but they all come with the same training intensity, right? I mean, you can change drills for different athletes, but everyone's got to come with the same mindset. And so for a young player, I think to find a team and a coach that's going to match this environment, this conversation, even this language of vulnerability. And you mentioned growth mindset. I think a lot of what that comes back to is feeling safe in that vulnerability. I think it's a place where parents can really be an incredible support system, right? Making sure that their athlete feels safe in being vulnerable. It's also a place I think sometimes where parents can be a real barrier, right? In trying to do their best to care for their child, they can sometimes get in the way of that vulnerability. But I think it comes to finding an environment where you can be all those things that are in the end going to make you great.
Absolutely. So you touched on that idea of values. I know obviously that sometimes it's hard to establish as an adult. Really, what are your values? What do you stand for in that? So how do you help young athletes do that?
Well, one of the first ones is just shining a light on that. Like even just asking that question, what's important to you? What do you value? And I think an extension of that, and for a lot of young players, this is a place to begin, is just thinking about their own ego and where ego fits into it. I mean, we have a sport that is essentially based on managing errors. And there's a lot of times where ego interrupts athletes performing at their best. They want to protect their ego. They make excuses. They have blame, right? These kind of things. And so I think even just kind of starting by shining a light and asking this question of, what do you get your identity for? What kind of player do you want to be? Are you upholding that? And then kind of returning to some of these questions about, okay, today in practice, did I train the way I want to? Did I interact with my coaches and the teammates the way I want to? And kind of coming back to that evaluation a little bit. And the reality is we make errors when we serve, and we're going to make errors in our conduct. Being able to say to a teammate, hey, that wasn't my best moment. Can I have a do-over, right? Hey, I said that and I really meant this, but you need to be in an environment where that's okay, where that's safe to do. And then this kind of creates an opportunity to say, this is who I am and this is who I want to be going forward.
I love those questions as reflection at the end of the day. Did I show up on the court as I wanted to, skill-wise, and to my teammates, to my coaches, and that relationship component? So you mentioned that idea of the support network is really critical around the athlete. So if an athlete wants that support but doesn't know where to start with that, like how to build that support network in their current level of play, maybe in where they aim to be, what advice would you give?
Well, watching a video like this, and it's the first step, right? Like there's so many incredible resources out there of people who are talking about this. I mean, growth mindset wasn't even a term that we embraced 15 years ago, right? And now it's a term that we can use and we both understand and others do as well. So I think for players to begin searching out those things, finding what resources are going to resonate with them. The other thing that's really true, and we talked earlier about some players have a particular skill set or a physical ability. Everyone's pathway is different. And so there's no one real formula for where you can find those resources. However, every athlete is going to begin that journey at some point. And so whether it's mentors you're finding in your club or your school, on your team, if there's something you're finding out in the world, maybe you're a reader, maybe you want to watch YouTube videos. I think just starting to evaluate that and look for those resources is really the first step.
Yeah, I really love that idea of we each have our own path, because I think that's really important for young players to hear, especially when they're developing. We know that sometimes physiologically you don't always catch up when it comes to maturation until a little bit later, especially on the guys' side. So thinking about that idea of your path is your own, focus on what your strengths are, is a really sound piece of advice.
Thanks. I think comparison can be incredibly uplifting. Comparison for greatness. I want to be this type of person. I want to make these kind of accomplishments. As an outcome goal that motivates you, that gets you going, that gets you working hard. These can be really powerful. But comparison can also be really damaging, detrimental, right? I mean, we have models of people and we assume we need to look like them or act like them or play like them. And that may not necessarily be our reality. So I think when young people are developing, they start off in and this is such my experience of doing this and being a teacher, you start off grouped with a bunch of people who are very similar to you in age, right? And development. And then you kind of progress, and we go through this in high school, but you show up here and we've got kids who are 23 months different in age, and comparison maybe doesn't work in that same way. And then if you're really thinking about moving beyond the USA pipeline, development pipeline, and moving on to the national team, moving on to college, where you're going to be a freshman playing against a fifth-year senior, or you're talking about even going to be a pro athlete, those kind of comparisons aren't always real beneficial, right? But that's a mindset you've got to grow out of at some point.
So on that kind of topic, as you think about the strategies you've used to help young athletes set realistic goals and kind of understand the process to get to those outcome goals, what are some of the techniques that you found to be most effective for young athletes in setting realistic goals and then keeping themselves accountable as they move toward that?
Yeah, I think great coaches, and I strive to be one, have to be really good at asking great questions. And I think being able to ask the right question at the right time is really important. And one of the things I would say for a lot of coaches is to be mindful of the environment that you're in. You can't get into an identity conversation in the timeout of the third set, right? But coaches sometimes will get into that and they'll fall into that trap, right? This is not who you are. Let's be something different. So I think being attentive to environment, asking some really good questions, and then also figuring out what resources can work. As coaches, we are given so many things, models of players that we've worked with. I had an incredible conversation with 4 coaches this morning at breakfast. It's like, these are resources that I have. So then which one do I choose to pair with an athlete? Is it an article I read, a story I heard? And so figuring that out as your coach's toolkit, I think is really important. And then matching that with a player that's appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. So as a young athlete maybe is experiencing barriers to their success, maybe they didn't make it into the NTDP training series or onto the national team, or they're not actively being recruited by a college and they were hoping to be. How do you help them frame that?
Yeah. One of the first ones is, it is totally okay to be upset, disappointed, frustrated, angry. You can't jump a hurdle, right? Any more than if you're walking along the street and somebody blares a horn at you and you jump, you can stop that reaction. So I think being willing to acknowledge that, we mentioned vulnerability. That's about understanding where you are. That's not about being perfect. And so the first thing I would suggest to any athlete is, these are okay. These are human emotions. The next question starts to become, how are you going to manage those emotions and how are you going to work through those emotions? Because the barriers will come. Even think about our senior team. There are players who aren't playing a whole lot, who are all Americans, who are some of the best players we've ever had in the country. And so even if that's our model, then we've all got to understand that there are going to be barriers to our success. But I think first being willing to, maybe I'd say even embrace the challenge a little bit, embrace the emotion. If you try to just push it away, pretend like it doesn't bother you, you're not really dealing with the issue. And I think you've got to deal with that first to then say, okay, I've had the response. Now I can step over the hurdle. Now I can move on after the horn.
Yeah. I think that's really key, that awareness piece, and then the acceptance that the emotion is okay. We're emotional people. Mm-hmm. And of course, we're going to be disappointed if we hit an obstacle or we don't meet the goal that we want.
Well, and it's empathy, right? I mean, I think it's empathy going back to values and going back to finding environment. It's empathy from parents and mentors. So often what I see as we go back to barriers is when the pain happens, the sadness happens, oftentimes we want to deflect, right? It's not my fault, it was this. Or we want to protect, the coach didn't do this, right? So instead of being willing to have some empathy for the experience is the way in which we're going to grow and move past that. And if I can try and make it a little bit more of a real grounded situation, in the moment that we're competing and we're not playing our best, sending energy at the coach or sending energy at the official is wasted energy. Learning how, through our own breathing, our own routine, our own mindset, to reset ourselves for the next point, that's a skill that is learned over not making a roster, not being a starter, right? That's a skill that's learned over time. And then you just get faster and faster and better at doing it. And then when you're playing in world championships and you get aced and everybody's yelling at you and you're real bummed, you've developed this skill to reset.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are some of the most important skills that may be more of the life skill orientation, or skills that the athletes can take off the court that are really critical as they think about being present on the court?
Yeah, I think all of these. I mean, it's practice, right? We just had a practice, or we say sometimes we had a training session. We are practicing these skills. Coach Sullivan has our camp really focused on culture, and he's clear about culture is a skill, much the same way as serving and passing. So it is a skill that requires practice. And I think a lot of times we believe that we need to be perfect at these things. But if you think about some of the professions in our society that are upheld to be the highest, right? You practice law, you practice medicine, right? These are things that you practice. You're never perfect at it. You are constantly working at your craft. And so these are skills that are practice. Our relationship off the court, my relationship with my educators, with my peers, with a partner, right, are the same as practicing the relationship with my setter and my libero and my assistant coach.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you think about other resources that young athletes can utilize, aside from building a support network, kind of working on those skills individually, what other resources exist that maybe they can use as they think about their progression as an athlete?
I mean, I think there's a whole litany, and again, going back to everybody's journey is different. Some athletes really going to get into yoga. Some athletes are going to learn that strength training is their Zen place. The bar doesn't lie, right? So like, this is a really good place to practice facing barriers. I think journaling, I think reading, I think watching film, conversations, these things. I think there's a whole lot of resources. There's probably a whole lot I've never even thought about, given the development of technology and social media and how we're learning to become better athletes and competitors. That's a question I've got some ideas for, but I'm really excited to see what athletes come up with.
Yeah, that's perfect. So last kind of question that I'd like to probe you on here is the idea of playing intelligently. So how do athletes understand and build kind of that court IQ? Maybe how can they play smart in the game?
Yeah, well, and I think this is a place we talked a little bit earlier, right? Like, players who are at this camp have some bar of physical ability or technical skill. And then as players are moving up the courts and getting ready for the U19 team, they're being able to compete with both of those. The part that's missing for a lot of young athletes, and I think this is something that's emerging in high school and club, is scouting reports, tactical understanding, starting to become more of a student of the game. And, we have such great resources. Here at the NTDP, the players have access to Huddle and they're watching film. And unfortunately, what most of the players will do is they'll go and try and find that great blocker, that great drill. And this is awesome. You do that, right? Do that. It fills your tank up. But you also need to go and take a look at, why did I get a kill in that particular situation? Why didn't I get a kill? Now, sometimes it's a technical thing. And we as coaches give them a lot of feedback in camp. Your feet weren't to the ball. Your rhythm was off. But there's a whole other aspect. Well, I tried to take a line swing against the biggest blocker in the gym. That tactical understanding is still really developing and emerging. And for athletes who really want to be successful as they move through the USA pipeline and as they get ready for collegiate play, scouting reports, preparing for an opponent, these kind of things can develop. And I think it's some simple stuff players can do if they just start maybe moving from their own performance to paying attention to their opponent. I'll give you an example. It's a challenge, but I think all of our players can do it. If you're playing a 6v6 match, by the time the opponent has had all 6 servers serve, can you identify what kind of serve they serve and where they hit it from, and maybe even what the location is? This is just an awareness in the game that's going to make you a better player. But you got to move away from your ego. You got to move away from your teammate. You got to start broadening your horizon to even get there.
Absolutely. Yeah, Karch had done a series for us on reading and kind of thinking about game IQ. And that was really what I was thinking about as you were talking, is paying attention to the game around you. You inherently have to take the focus a little bit off of yourself to pay attention to what's going on in the court.
Well, and I think it gets incredibly complicated for some players, because some players need to do less of that. Some players need to spend less time in their head, and they need to figure out that their pathway is to maybe not pay attention to that, like just react. But this is where it becomes so personal for every player.
So on that note, if you're working with a handful of athletes, one is somebody who needs to get out of their head, somebody else is maybe somebody who needs to get in that space a little bit more. What are the different cues you give those two athletes?
Well, I think that comes a lot to the skill of the coach and the responsibility of the coach, is how do I respond to those different athletes who are in different places? Cues, I think a lot of times, are questions. The tone of voice matters a lot. If you think about coaches and parents, what were you thinking can be said a whole lot of different ways to different athletes who are going to respond in unique ways to that question. But I think asking questions, I think getting players to be aware of what they've done and the choices they made, I think that's the strategy over and over and over again. It's amazing. Our bodies are these incredible computers, and they learn, but they only learn if there's an awareness. And if my awareness is somewhere else, it's really difficult to learn. And I think coaches can help players be aware of the right things at the right moment.
That's a perfect piece of advice, because if you're a young player, even paying attention to the cues, the questions that your coaches are posing to you can help be something you internalize. And then those are the questions you ask yourself in the moment.
There was a great moment in training. We're doing some serve and pass work, and we're working with liberos. And libero kind of, hey, tough situation. Hey, what happened on that ball? And his feedback was correct. His platform was a little late. And it's like, okay, well, what were our cues? And he immediately looked up and looked over to the whiteboard and off in the distance saw one of the cues and was like, I wasn't staying fluid. It's like, yeah, there it is. But he needs that opportunity. If all I do as a coach is jump in and, sure, maybe I need to give feedback once in a while. Hey, stay fluid. But that's me telling the athlete. That's not the athlete understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. So anything else as we wrap up this conversation that really comes to mind as being critical as an athlete thinks about progressing their game?
I think being mindful of, as we mentioned at the beginning, I think being mindful of your mindset, of what you're thinking about, what you're paying attention to, how you're navigating in these areas. The other thing I think is true is that athletes need to be kind to themselves and understand where they are individually. Some athletes right now are in a place in this camp where they're just trying to remember that we have a meeting at 10:45, and that's really okay. I mean, and that's where they are. That's why we have a development pipeline, right? And I think for other athletes, they need to challenge themselves a little bit more, right? As they go through this and figure out where they are in the pipeline.
Yep. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. It was fantastic, Jonah.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate it.